Welcome to Never Again is Now, a podcast about anti Semitism. I am Evelyn Marcus.
And I am Phyllis Zimbler Miller.
In commemoration of this year's Yom Hashoah, we will be talking with Joanna Sliwa about the resistance by women during the Holocaust. Joanna is the co author with Elizabeth White of The Counterfeit Countess, the Jewish woman who rescued thousands of Poles during the Holocaust. Joanna is a historian at the Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany, or the Claims Conference, and has a PhD in history from the Strassler Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Clark University. She's based in New Jersey, USA. Joanna, welcome to our show. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me on your podcast. It's a true honor.
First, let's acknowledge the elephant in the room. Jews went to the slaughter unresisting, is the popular refrain. And you co-wrote a book that showed this didn't always happen when the circumstances were right. And that this didn't even happen in Poland when the circumstances were right. Could you tell us about this?
I am glad that we begin with dispelling the myth about Jewish passivity during the Holocaust. The myth that Jews went blindly to their deaths implies that Jews did not fight back, that they did not devise survival or coping strategies, and that they were complicit in the speed and scope of their suffering. This false understanding of Jewish behavior during the Holocaust persisted for a long time and shifted the blame onto the Jews, at least in large part, for their own suffering during the Holocaust. And this kind of understanding of the Jewish experience conveniently disregards the conditions of Jewish life under Nazi rule and the complicity of non-Jewish populations in the persecution of their Jewish neighbors. For quite some time, Jewish resistance was understood mainly as standing up to the oppressors with weapons and by fighting. In December 1941, the leader of the Jewish resistance movement in the Vilna ghetto in Lithuania, Abba Kovner, urged his fellow resistors that they should not be led like sheep to the slaughter. And he followed up with a call to a revolt against the German oppressors. And while there were instances of armed revolts, such as in the Warsaw Ghetto in April 1943, the actual fighting the Germans with guns and explosives was the exception. Jews did not have access to weapons. They were isolated in ghettos. They feared repercussions that could be unleashed against other Jews. And they faced a largely hostile or indifferent local non-Jewish population. In fact, the Jewish resistance group in Vilna decided against staging a revolt in the ghetto. Instead, its members fled the ghetto to the nearby forests, where they eventually set up partisan units. Was that resistance? It sure was. Records from the Holocaust, as well as accounts of survivors and scholarly research, has shown that the scale of Jews' resistance efforts was much larger than previously thought, and that the modes of Jews' resistance were much more diverse than just armed resistance. This takes me to the story that I and my co-author Elizabeth Barry White revealed just last year, and that presents another layer to the discussion about Jewish resistance during the Holocaust. Our book, The Counterfeit Countess, the Jewish woman who rescued thousands of Poles during the Holocaust, explains how a Jewish woman mathematician and a teacher survived the Holocaust by assuming the false identity of a Polish Christian aristocrat. And used her position to join the Polish resistance and become a key member of a Polish relief organization. Her name was Pepi Melberg. She was 35 years old when the war broke out. She used the fake identity of Countess Janina Suchodolska to spearhead an unprecedented relief effort for those whom she could help that were non-Jewish Poles. She negotiated with top German Nazi officials in the city of Lublin, including with the manager of Operation Reinhard, which was the largest mass murder action in which the German authorities killed about 2 million Polish Jews. Janina entered the Majdanek concentration camp in Lublin, Poland, almost daily to deliver food and medicine for thousands of Polish, non-Jewish prisoners. During her official deliveries, she smuggled in secret messages, books, even razor blades to aid prisoner escapes. And she smuggled out reports that allowed the Polish resistance to grasp the situation in the camp. Janina helped Polish refugees fleeing from mass murder actions of the Ukrainian nationalists. And she rescued Polish peasants whom the German authorities expelled from their villages and confined in the Majdanek camp. So Janina Melberg was a Jewish rescuer of non-Jewish Poles during World War II. That is a unique story that shows the scope and scale of Jews' resistance during the Holocaust.
I think, I come from the background of Holocaust survivors in my family and in my native Jewish community in the Netherlands. Also, there were also, now we know in hindsight what happened with people who let themselves be taken away, or who were taken away, even if they, would be willing to resist it. But they didn't know what was going to happen. And there was always, that's what I heard from many survivors, there was always the thought, the Germans would threaten us, that if we cooperated, things would be fine. But if we wouldn't cooperate, we would certainly be killed. So there was maybe also the betting on, if we cooperate, then maybe we have a chance to survive. Didn't that also add to the attitude of non-resistance of most Jews who were transported to the camps?
Absolutely. I think today we're looking at it with the knowledge that we have, with the massive scholarship that's been undertaken over the years. And you're right, Evelyn. At the time, people had limited information. It doesn't mean that they didn't have the information, some information. We have research on that as well about how news traveled, how people communicated to learn what was happening. There was this belief in ghettos about the existence of killing centers from where Jews were deported and where no one ever returned. So that was also happening. But I think when we speak about resistance and why some Jews undertook these armed forms of resistance or joined groups of resistance, we definitely have to take into account other factors such as conditions in ghettos, fear for the Jews' families, for those who would be left behind, and what would happen to them. What would the Nazi authorities take revenge? Would these people left in the ghettos be killed because a group of others managed to escape from the ghetto or stage a revolt? Those were serious questions. And then the younger members of families did not want to leave their loved ones behind in ghettos, their parents, their grandparents, their children, and extended families. Geography played a role as well. when we consider what kind of resistance was possible in different regions of Europe.
Right. Are there other Jewish women, including women who actually fought alongside Jewish male partisans, that you can give us some accounts of, who resisted?
I mentioned earlier that members of the Jewish resistance escaped from the Vilna ghetto to the forest. In total, about 30,000 Jews formed partisan units or joined larger non-Jewish partisan groups all over Europe. Approximately 3,000 of them were Jewish women. And Faye Schulman was one of them. She was 23 years old when she fled from the Lenin ghetto in what today is Belarus. Her parents and her siblings were murdered by the Germans, and there was nothing keeping her in the ghetto. Faye was allowed to join a partisan unit composed of Soviet soldiers because of her connection to her brother-in-law, who was a physician. The unit needed medical staff. Faye had no medical training, but she managed to pass off as a nurse for the unit for about 2 years. Her role in the resistance group acquired a different dimension when she began photographing various scenes of the partisans' activities. And so Faye's resistance efforts morphed into documenting Jewish and non-Jewish partisans. And this yielded visual evidence of Jews' resistance among the partisans. Faye fought back by helping her wounded comrades and by using her camera to gather evidence. Other Jewish women who joined the partisans took up guns and engaged in sabotage of infrastructure to inhibit Nazi plans. For example, in today's North Macedonia, 19-year-old Jamila Kolonomos found herself first under German and then Bulgarian control. She was a member of the Zionist youth group, Hashomer HaTzair, which shaped her outlook and her actions. She not only contributed to partisan efforts by making shoes for the partisans, but she also joined a resistance cell. Jamila managed to evade a deportation action in her hometown of Bitola. And then she, together with 3 other Jewish women resistors from her town, were smuggled to the mountain region of Greece to join a partisan unit there. Yanina became a political leader of the unit. She also became the editor of the group's newsletter. Her role extended to preparing reports for her detachment and leading educational sessions in cities that had been freed from German rule. Jamila was also a fighter, and she took part in the liberation of Macedonian cities.
Interesting. Very interesting. Okay, so what are the smallest acts of resistance that took place by women? And I literally mean small acts, just to show us.
There were spectacular stories of Jewish women's resistance, like the ones that I just mentioned. And then there were everyday acts of resistance that were also spectacular because of the conditions in which they took place. My first book, Jewish Childhood in Krakow, A Microhistory of the Holocaust, explored Jewish children's experiences in the city of Krakow, Poland. And while the focus was on children, the choices, decisions, and actions of Jewish women really shined through. Some Jewish mothers tried to ensure secret education for their children once the German authorities banned Jewish children from schools. Even before being confined in the Krakow ghetto, Rena Ferber and her friends attended clandestine lessons in different houses every morning. The girls' mothers took turns standing watch for German patrols. Rina explained that the parents wanted to make sure that their children were receiving education because they expected the war to end soon. Mothers also arranged for their children to receive religious education when the practice of religion was banned. They tried to celebrate life cycle events as a way to create a sense of normalcy in the ghetto. Maurits Sternlicht's mother hired a rabbinical student as a tutor for her son and arranged for Maurits to have a bar mitzvah. In case Maurits survived, he would be able to continue life as a Jew. That was the mother's reasoning, and that was important to Maurits's mother. While most children had a parent or other relative in the Krakow ghetto, there were children who did not have a family. They were housed in an orphanage whose director was a woman. Her name was Anna Feuerstein. During the German raid on the Krakow ghetto in October 1942, Anna and her husband accompanied the children to the deportation train that took them to the Belzec killing center. Anna declined an offer to be released from the transport. She chose to stay with the over 100 children and die together with them. That was resistance. In a forthcoming book that I co-edited with Christine Schmidt of the Wiener Holocaust Library in London and Elizabeth Anthony from the US Holocaust Memorial Museum, we focused on older Jews. So this volume emphasizes also how elderly Jewish women experienced the Holocaust. For example, one text by Katarzyna Persson and Maria Ferenc engages with the elderly's fate in the Warsaw Ghetto. They discuss the story of Estera Bieżuner, who managed to evade the major deportation from the ghetto in the summer of 1942 by hiding in basements and on roofs. And eventually she managed to escape from the ghetto to a hiding place on the so-called Aryan, non-Jewish side of Warsaw. And hiding was no small act of resistance to survive. So there were many examples that we could go on, but I wanted to give you just kind of a sample of them.
And what would you consider some of the largest acts of resistance that took place, apart from what you already told us about?
To answer that, I will return to the notion of Jewish armed resistance in ghettos. Just a few years ago, Judy Battalion published an important book about the untold stories of Jewish women resistors. And one of the women she focused on was Renia Kukiełka. Similar to another young woman that I mentioned earlier from Macedonia, Renia also was a member of a Jewish youth movement, but in Poland. She operated as a courier for the Jewish armed resistance, delivering documents, smuggling weapons, similar to other women resistance operatives who exited ghettos and traveled between cities to communicate with members of the resistance and deliver contraband. Renia could blend in because of her looks and her fluency in the local language. She refused to reveal her true identity and disclose other members in the resistance, even when she was brutally interrogated by the Germans. And in an ultimate act of resistance, she managed to escape from a Nazi prison. Women were important members of the Jewish Fighting Organization in the Warsaw Ghetto. A very well-known figure, one of the founders of the organization in Warsaw, was Sylwia Lubetkin. She was 25 years old at the start of the war. She fought in the Warsaw Ghetto uprising that began on April 19th, 1943. Sylwia assumed different roles during that time. She had a difficult responsibility to maintain contact between the organization's leadership and fighters when the ghetto was set ablaze by the Germans. She managed to escape the ghetto through the sewers with the last fighters who got out of the burning ghetto. She hid on the Aryan side, And what is more, she joined the Warsaw Uprising in August 1944.
Wait,
This was
wait.
a revolt. Yes,
I
this was a
have to
revolt.
explain this to our listeners. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising is not the same as the Warsaw Uprising that was done by the Poles. So uh, I just need to make that point because otherwise it sounds like you're talking about the same thing.
Right, and that's what I wanted to say, that the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in August 1944 was a revolt
No, no,
staged
no,
by the
no.
Polish resistance.
Yeah,
Right, it is
sorry.
different than the
Warsaw Ghetto
Warsaw Ghetto.
Uprising is in 43.
Right,
Warsaw
yes.
Uprising is in 44. Yeah, okay.
Right, and I did say that before, that Sylwia was part of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in April 1943. She escaped the ghetto, and then she also managed to join the fighters of the Polish resistance in a year later, in August 1944. Um, another example is rescue as resistance. Reha Freyer from Germany was around 41 years old in 1933 when she created the Youth Aliyah. This was an effort to train Jewish youth and bring them from Germany to British Mandate Palestine. She faced many difficulties, not least from the parents who did not want to part with their children and send them into the unknown. Rehat's goal was to whisk the Jewish youth and send them out of Germany, where discrimination measures were affecting their educational and economic opportunities. By 1941, Recha removed herself from this initiative, but the foundations that she created allowed thousands of young Jews to escape Europe during the Holocaust and after the Holocaust, when continued anti-Semitism affected Jews' lives in their home countries. Speaking of those big efforts, organizing relief was also a form of resistance. Laura Margolis, an American Jewish woman, was 38 years old when she found herself in Shanghai, China, in 1941 on an assignment from the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, the JDC. Her role was to organize help for the 5,000 most needy Jews of the 20,000 who fled from Nazi Germany to Shanghai. Laura set up soup kitchens. She negotiated with Japanese authorities who controlled Shanghai at the time. She procured funds, all in a situation in which her American-based organization was formally banned from operating in Axis territories. A recent book by Deborah Dwork, Saints and Liars, explains how Laura was able to succeed in her efforts, which were both clandestine and official.
So, Joanna, we all know, of course, the devastating numbers of loss in the those who experienced the Holocaust. Do you Could you give us an indication of the positive results of these acts of small and bigger acts of resistance?
I think that these acts, both what we consider smaller, right, such as lighting candles on Shabbat when the observance of religion was banned, or those grand acts that I just mentioned, I think that they show the level of disobedience to Nazi authorities, and they show Jews' efforts to try to devise coping mechanisms, survival strategies, to help them live another hour, another day. Um, they signify the hope that Jews harbored for a future and they invested a lot of it in the future of the children, right? By offering education and making sure that the young children learned about Judaism, and later that some children were placed on the so-called Aryan side, received false identities to try to survive. So I think, and it also shows when we talk about resistance, and here we're talking about resistance of Jewish women, just to understand that this was not resistance was not only a men's domain. Women were very much part of it, and they took up important roles in, for example, the Jewish resistance groups in the ghettos would not have received as many weapons and grenades and bullets if it wasn't for couriers, if it wasn't for these women such as Renia Kukeuka, whom I mentioned earlier, who traveled from ghetto to ghetto to deliver this contraband.
Do you think any lives were saved by these acts of resistance of these Jewish women?
Oh, absolutely. We have plenty of examples, and I'm glad you're asking, because some women took up roles such as procuring false documents or for Jewish escapees from ghettos to use on the Aryan side. That contributed to saving lives.
So, let's talk about the role of the four women who were hanged. Hanged? Yes, in Auschwitz because they helped smuggle gunpowder, out of a factory where they were working to a Sonderkommando who, even though at the risk of their own deaths, tried to blow up the crematorium.
Revolts in the killing centers, in two other killing centers at Treblinka and Sobibor, broke out in 1943, and they enabled a small number of prisoners to escape and survive. In Auschwitz-Birkenau, the Jewish prisoners rebelled in October 1944. The prisoners who were part of the Sonderkommando, this was a special unit that was forced to work in the crematoria, they had been preparing for this revolt for some time. Together with Jewish women who worked in the munitions factory and in sorting the belongings of the murdered Jews, the Sonderkommando members forged a resistance network.
In the camp, in Auschwitz, just to make it clear.
In Auschwitz-Birkenau, exactly. Three women, their names were Esther Weizblum, Ella Gärtner, and Regina Saphir-Stein. They smuggled small amounts of gunpowder that was then delivered by another woman, Róża Robota, to the Sonderkommando prisoners. This was an extremely dangerous undertaking, and yet the women agreed to participate in it. When the Sonderkommando prisoners at one of the crematoria learned that they might be soon killed, they staged a revolt by blowing up the crematorium. As a result of this rebellion, the German guards killed over 400 Jews. The women resistors, as Phyllis explained earlier, were discovered and they were hanged just 21 days before liberation of Auschwitz. In an act of defiance and bravery, the women sang Hatikva, the Zionist hymn, now the national anthem of the State of Israel. These four women were all from Poland. Róża Robota had been a member of the Zionist youth movement and the resistance organization in the ghetto where she had lived before deportation to Auschwitz. Esther Weizblum and her parents and sister were deported first to Majdanek. I mentioned Majdanek earlier in reference to the Jewish woman who, as a fake countess, helped Polish prisoners. Esther and her sister Anna were then transferred from Majdanek to Auschwitz. They formed a group, which was not uncommon in the context of the camps, of women who supported each other through small and big acts. Both of the sisters smuggled gunpowder, but only Esther was discovered. Anna survived the Holocaust to tell this story. Another woman, Ala Gertner, was drafted into the slave labor camps in Western Poland before she was deported to Auschwitz. And one of the special things that survived from her or about her were letters that Ala penned to her Jewish friend from the same ghetto where both of them lived. Regina Satirstein, the fourth woman, was a young widow when she was deported to Auschwitz with her extended family. What is important to know about these women is that they risked and eventually gave their lives in order to resist the Germans. They joined forces and showed incredible courage to stand up to their oppressors. Their actions enabled prisoners to destroy a crematorium and fight the assessment in the camp, even though they knew full well that they did not stand a chance of victory or of freeing the camp.
Yes, when I read about these women, I just, well, they signed their own death certificates, but they did it for the greater good. And I just think that that was just incredible.
Yeah,
Evelyn?
it was a sign of non-acceptance without a chance of winning, but at least a sign of non-acceptance of
Of
what was
fighting
going on.
back.
Yeah. What lessons, Joanna, can we learn today from the accounts of the women you have been telling us about in this episode?
So I will return to the story of Faye Schulman, the partisan nurse and photographer from Belarus that I spoke about earlier. She said in a post-war account that she wanted people to know that there was resistance, that Jews did not go like sheep to the slaughter. That's what she said. She also stated that she ensured that there was a visual proof of that. We just touched on a few examples of Jewish women's resistance. The lesson is that resistance was extensive and it took many forms. The lesson is also about how much more there is to discover and tell so that these individual and collective stories of Jewish women's agency and bravery are known.
I think that that's, I think the women get short shift in history books until recently. And I think that something like your book, the Counterfeit Countess, is an amazing story. I'll just ask you to tell us this one thing about, I asked you earlier, has she been recognized in Poland? And you said,
And I said, no. For her story was unknown. I mean, we were talking about the Countess Janina Suchodolska, meaning the Janina Melberg. That was her post-war name. In scholarship and about Majdanek, also in accounts by survivors from Majdanek, we know of a Countess Suchodolska, but no one knew that she was Jewish. My hope, and Barry's, my co-author's hope, is that with the publication of the book, with the release of the book in the Polish translation, that the story of Janina Melberg will be better known and that she will be recognized for the tremendous acts of courage and risk that she took in order to save non-Jewish Poles.
I mean, the thought of her every day entering the lion's den of Majdanek, and it's just, well, anyway, Evelyn, if you don't have any other questions, I think that that's probably a really excellent visual to end with, that these women, in whatever case, entered the lion's den. Either they came out or they didn't, but they resisted. And I thank you, Joanna, so much for coming on the show and sharing with us these incredible tales, of which it's just a teeny little bit, of women resisting in the Holocaust, Jewish women resisting in the Holocaust. Anyway, I thank you so much. I thank our listeners. I thank Evelyn and myself for our efforts to bring this show, but also to, for those of you who want to know more about us, to go to Never Again Is Now podcast at Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or Spotify to read more. And as we say with every episode, speak up against anti-Semitism and all hate.